He ignored her seventh frantic call, letting it go to voicemail while, 7 months pregnant, an iron band tightened around her chest and stars exploded behind her eyes. The phone tumbled from her numb fingers and clattered on the polished concrete floor, her strangled cry echoing in the sterile, minimalist loft as the
Today marks
small
a
life
monumental
she'd fought
achievement for
so
everyone
hard for
involved.
was
Our
suddenly at
initial public
risk.
offering is
He
just the
saw
beginning of a
every
new
alert.
era of
He
innovation and
glanced at
growth.
every
As you can
message.
see, the shell
He watched the
corporations are
words,
layered here and
Clara,
here.
But
hospital,
where is
the
the money
baby,
actually going?
Yeah,
flash
that's what
across the
offshore
screen of his
accounts
smart
secure.
watch.
Did you confess
Then,
to
with
the
a
police?
flick of his thumb, he dismissed the notification, leaned toward his
How does your
chief
wife feel
operating
about this?
officer, and signaled the sommelier for another bottle of vintage Cabernet. The name she gasped before the world went dark was his, but Julian Croft wasn't stuck in an emergency meeting in Seoul. He was 90 minutes away, celebrating at his private vineyard in Napa. What came next was a masterclass in controlled demolition, because the pregnant wife he left for dead wasn't just a partner, she was the prodigy coder who wrote the foundational algorithm his entire tech empire was built on, and her godfather was the man who'd spent a career as the most relentless federal prosecutor in the Northern District of California's Cybercrime Division. When Clara uncovered the full reality of Julian's betrayal, his affair, and the audacious intellectual property theft that was the real engine of his company's valuation, she didn't shatter. She didn't rage. She began writing a new kind of code. This is the story of how a betrayed wife and her brilliant godfather systematically dismantled the kingdom of every person who threatened her son. And I guarantee, by the time the final line of code executes, you will be applauding. Stay with us until the end. The payback is total. And if this story sparks that same strength in your own soul, I would be deeply grateful if you would hit that subscribe button. Leave your thoughts in the comments below and join our community so you don't miss a single step of the takedown. Let's begin. 4 months later, on a cool, foggy evening in San Francisco, the cavernous hall of the Moscone Center buzzed with energy for the city's annual Innovate Forward Tech Gala. Clara Reed stood beside a holographic display, a perfect image of serene composure. Her expression was placid, her posture impeccable, her entire being radiating a quiet, dangerous power. She wore a severe but elegant midnight blue gown, a dress that conveyed both immense wealth and unbreachable defenses. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight, architectural bun. Not a single hair dared to fall. To any casual observer, she was the brilliant, supportive wife. But beneath that composed surface, a cold, precise rage was being honed to a razor's edge. The voice of her husband, Julian, boomed from the main stage, his keynote speech filled with empty platitudes about innovation, transparency, and building a better world. Clara had stopped believing in Julian's world 4 months ago, on a night of pure terror when she nearly lost her son alone while he was at a strategic offsite in wine country with his mistress. Now, at the gala, meant to celebrate his company's latest triumph, a groundbreaking international partnership, she was about to trigger its spectacular collapse. Clara permitted herself a tiny internal smile, not of happiness, but of certainty. A debt was about to be paid in full. Her own words, whispered in the antiseptic silence of a cardiac care unit, echoed in her memory. They say a betrayal of that scale is supposed to break you, but it didn't break me. It reminded me what I am capable of building. And the people who almost took my son from me are about to learn that I am Marcus Blackwood's goddaughter. And Marcus never, ever underestimates a system's vulnerabilities. Julian wrapped up his speech to a thunderous ovation. Tech journalists swarmed the stage, shouting questions. Clara didn't hear a thing. Her attention was locked on two figures basking in the stage lights, her husband, Julian Croft, and his mistress, Isabel Thorne, his chief operating officer, standing intimately and triumphantly at his side. She could already write their future headlines. Julian Croft, indicted for economic espionage and securities fraud. Isabel Thorne, career obliterated, facing charges of conspiracy. Justice, executed with algorithmic precision. But that was the end result. To understand how Clara Reed was transformed from an expectant mother into the kill script for a tech mogul's life, we have to go back. Back to a morning that started like any other. Back to a life that looked perfect from the outside, but was built on a foundation of lies. 4 months earlier, the San Francisco fog was a thick, gray blanket against the glass. It was a damp chill that penetrated even the triple-paned, floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse overlooking the bay. Clara Reed moved through the stark, minimalist kitchen with the careful, measured gait of her third trimester. Her entire world had been narrowed to a single mission: protecting the fragile life she carried. It was a high-risk pregnancy, a diagnosis that turned every day into a delicate balancing act. On the vast quartz island, an automatic blood pressure cuff sat next to a row of prescription bottles. She rested a hand on her stomach, feeling the soft, reassuring thump of a kick. A little life who was counting on her, and on a man who was becoming more unrecognizable by the day. She schooled her features, suppressing the persistent hum of anxiety that had become her shadow for months. She smoothed the fabric of her silk maternity tunic, drew in a slow breath, and poured a glass of water. "Just a little longer, my sweet boy," she whispered. "We're almost there." The sharp, confident clicks of expensive Italian sneakers on the concrete floor announced his arrival. Julian Croft materialized in the doorway, a human vortex of relentless ambition. He was already wearing his daily uniform, a $1,000 custom hoodie, designer jeans, and an expression of focused intensity. He was wearing a different cologne, something subtle with notes of sandalwood she had never smelled on him before. He didn't glance at her stomach. His eyes barely registered her presence. His universe was contained in the glowing rectangle of his phone, his thumb swiping through encrypted messages on a secure app. Clara observed him, a silent analyst in her own home, cataloging the small betrayals she had been trying to dismiss for months. The way his phone screen was always angled, just out of her sight, the faint, smug curl of his lip when he read certain texts, the utter lack of connection in his eyes when he finally bothered to look up at her. "My appointment with the perinatologist is at 3 o'clock this afternoon," Clara said, her voice steady. "I really, really need you to come with me this time." Julian didn't look up. "The final term sheets with the Seoul Consortium are being signed today. I can't blow up a $10 billion deal for a routine ultrasound. He said it was critical for you to be there." At that, he finally met her gaze, and it was glacial. The passionate, brilliant coder she had fallen in love with was gone, replaced by this ruthless CEO. "Someone has to fund this entire operation, Clara. That includes the team of world-class specialists you insisted on hiring. Or have you forgotten what our monthly burn rate is?" The barb hit its mark with calculated cruelty. Clara absorbed the impact, a familiar ache blooming in her chest. She had put her own celebrated career as a sought-after software architect on indefinite hold. She had paused her own groundbreaking work to support his, to create the stable home life they had both sworn they wanted more than anything, and now he wielded that sacrifice like a weapon. Julian picked up his laptop bag from the counter. He made no move to kiss her. He didn't rest a hand on her belly. He offered not one word about the child that was supposed to be their shared dream. "Julian," she tried again, her voice softening just a fraction. "Please, He's going to go over the delivery plan. It's it's getting very close. For a split second, a trace of the old Julian seemed to surface in his eyes. A spark of warmth, perhaps. Then it was extinguished, sealed behind the impenetrable wall of his ambition. You can give me the executive summary tonight. I am building a legacy for this family, Clara. You should be able to appreciate the scale of what I'm accomplishing. He walked out. The heavy front door swung shut, the smart lock engaging with a soft, final thud. Clara stood, alone in the ringing silence of their perfect life. Her hands instinctively went back to her belly, a protective shield. A question she had been pushing away for months returned with sickening force. Was this baby part of his legacy, or just another data point to enhance his public brand? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to banish the thought. Your father loves us, she whispered to her womb, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He's just under an unbelievable amount of pressure. He is building something amazing for us. The lie felt like bad code. It simply wouldn't compile. But what was the alternative? That the man she had built her world with now saw their own son as an obstacle, that his perfect family was just another slide in a pitch deck for venture capitalists? She shook her head, clinging to the fading hope that she was wrong. I love you, she promised the child inside her. I love you more than anything in this entire world. She had no idea that in less than 12 hours, that love would be pushed to its absolute limit. The late afternoon sun was turning the fog a shade of bruised orange when the first intense, crushing pain seized her chest. It was immediate, stunning, and completely wrong. She cried out, her fingers digging into the edge of the quartz countertop to keep from falling. A dizzying, disorienting fog filled her head. Her doctor's stern warnings about the symptoms of severe hypertension flashed like a critical error message in her mind. Another wave of pain crested, sharp and brutal, leaving her breathless. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone, her thumb hovering over Julian's contact photo before pressing it. The call went on, finally surrendering to his polished corporate voicemail. She tried a second time, voicemail again, a deep, profound cold, unrelated to the Boston sea breeze, seeped into her very marrow. She managed to type a message. Something is very wrong. Call me. Followed by another. Julian, please. The baby. Going to the hospital. She was trapped in their waterfront condo, a glass box suspended over the harbor, and the man who had promised to be her anchor was nowhere to be found. A surge of adrenaline cut through the pain. She had to find his COO's number, his assistant, anyone. His sleek messenger bag was slung over a chair in his home office, right where he'd dropped it. Each step was a monumental effort as she made her way there. While searching for a contact list, a small, glossy card fell onto the antique rug. It was an invitation to a private gallery viewing. A knot of pure dread formed in her gut. She typed the gallery's name into her browser. The front page of a popular Boston arts blog appeared, featuring photos from the event just last week. There was Julian, smiling broadly, his arm possessively around Serena Monroe, the gallery's owner. And on Serena's wrist was a delicate, one-of-a-kind platinum bracelet, a piece Julian had described to her as a potential investor gift. The post was dated just last night. He wasn't overseeing a late-night server migration for his new software launch. He was across town with his mistress. The betrayal was a physical shock, eclipsing the agony twisting in her abdomen. She stared at the screen, at the image of him at a gallery event he had dismissed as a boring networking obligation, and her carefully constructed life began to fracture. Every flimsy excuse, every business trip that stretched into a long weekend, every faint scent of turpentine on his suits, it all converged into a single, soul-crushing revelation. As she stared at the image, another vicious spasm ripped through her body. She looked down and saw a horrifying bloom of dark red soaking through her silk pajama bottoms. Her doctor's final, insistent warning echoed in her ears. Any significant bleeding, Chloe? You don't hesitate. You call 911 immediately. With the glowing screen bearing witness to her husband's treachery, she finally, with a trembling finger, dialed the 3 digits that would save her life and demolish his. His voice was gentle but firm. You are an incredibly resilient woman, Mrs. Croft, but your body is under immense strain, and this level of stress is a real threat. You have to give me your word. You'll call the moment you feel any severe cramping, any spotting at all. Can you do that for me? Chloe nodded, her hand instinctively cupping her belly. I'll call. Excellent, the doctor said, making a note in her file with a reassuring smile. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, I am begging you, find a way to get some rest. Chloe murmured her thanks, buttoned her coat, and walked out of the clinic onto Beacon Street, into the sharp, damp Boston air. A storm was rolling in over the harbor. Her phone vibrated. A text from Julian. Server Farm is a catastrophe. I'll be here all night. Don't wait up. She erased it without a response. That evening, Chloe moved through their Beacon Hill apartment with a strange, methodical serenity, as though some deep, animal part of her knew her world was about to be torn apart. She drew a warm bath, moving carefully with her heavy belly. She slipped into a soft cotton nightgown. She sat in the half-finished nursery, gently stroking her own arm and humming to the baby nestled inside her. Her eyes landed on a shelf of beloved children's books. What should we read tonight, my love? Chloe whispered, a sad smile touching her lips. The one about the little ducklings. She lifted the familiar book from its spot. They had read it so many times, but Chloe found comfort in its simplicity. A story about finding your way, about a mother's fierce protection against all dangers. She read the words aloud, her voice a low, soothing murmur in the big, silent apartment. She spoke each word clearly, feeling the baby's soft rolls and nudges against her palm. When she closed the book, a profound quiet descended, broken only by the distant wail of a ferry horn across the water. A lonely sound that matched the rhythm of her own heart. Mommy, she whispered to her stomach, giving voice to a terror she refused to fully accept. Are you going to be okay? The question hung in the charged air. She leaned down, pressing her cheek to her own skin. You are the bravest little soul I have ever known, she murmured, and we are not quitters. A tiny, determined kick was her answer, and she smiled, closing her eyes for a moment, watching the lights of the Seaport district twinkle through the coming storm. An hour or two passed. Chloe was in Julian's office, tidying a stack of financial reports when she saw it. A new email popped up on their shared tablet, which was synced to his phone. It was from their credit card company, a simple transaction alert. Merchant, Blackwood Executive Transport. Amount, $165. Time stamped for 10:52 p.m. tonight. Her blood turned to ice. She had expected to feel a surge of white-hot anger, a tidal wave of shock. Instead, there was just a cold, hollow certainty. A part of her had known for months. A part of her had felt him drifting away, leaving an ocean between them. Chloe looked at the charge for a long, long time. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she closed the tablet's cover. She could not fall apart now, not yet. Not with a northeaster battering the coast and her son safe inside her. She could not mourn the death of her marriage while she was preparing for the birth of her child. Tomorrow, she told herself, I will deal with this tomorrow. But the tomorrow she imagined would never arrive, because in less than 3 hours, Chloe Croft's entire existence would be shattered, and life would never be the same. The thing that jolted Chloe awake at 1:19 a.m. was not the sound of wind howling against the windows, but a sudden electrifying pain that shot through her, followed by a shocking gush of warmth. A contraction, like a vice grip, seized her from the inside. Her water had just broken. Her bare feet slid on the cold hardwood floor as she lurched toward the master bathroom. The reflection in the mirror made her gasp. Blood. She was only 32 weeks pregnant. This was dangerously early. The baby. Her hands flew to her belly, her eyes wide with fear. The sprawling apartment seemed to creak as a powerful gust of wind rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows, a sound like a wounded animal. My son. Chloe scrambled for her phone, cradling her abdomen, feeling the small, panicked kicks from within. He was a fighter, but something was terribly, horribly wrong. She grabbed her phone from the bedside table, her fingers trembling so much she could barely tap Julian's name. The call went directly to his assistant's line. She tried again. Voicemail. A third attempt. Voicemail. She switched to messages, her thumbs fumbling over the keyboard. Water broke. Bleeding. Going to Mass General. Please hurry. The message status updated instantly. Delivered. Then, a few heartbeats later, read at 1:27 a.m. No reply came. Chloe had no time to process the exquisite cruelty of his silence. She dialed 911, her voice sounding detached and steady as she relayed her address and condition to the operator. The dispatcher told her to stay on the line, to lie on her left side, and that an ambulance was en route. She clutched her belly, rocking gently, murmuring the same phrase like an incantation. Stay with me, my sweet boy. Mommy is here. Help is on its way. You're such a brave little fighter. Stay with me. Please just stay with me. The baby fluttered, a weak, frantic motion. Her lips formed a word she could hardly bear to say. Daddy. He's coming, my love, Chloe lied, hot tears streaming down her face. Daddy's on his way. But Daddy was not on his way. 50 floors up, in a penthouse overlooking the harbor, at the Four Seasons, Julian Croft was wrapped in 1,000-thread-count sheets with a woman who was not his wife. Serena was everything Chloe was not. Sharp-edged, driven, and completely unburdened by the tender vulnerability of approaching motherhood. Her lithe body was draped across Julian's, her perfectly lacquered nails drawing idle patterns on his skin. Julian's personal cell phone buzzed on the nightstand, and buzzed again, and a third time. Serena reached for it, her motion graceful as she glanced at the screen. She saw the name. She saw the word hospital. She's messaging again, Serena said, her voice a low murmur, tilting the phone so Julian could see the screen. It looks like an emergency. Julian barely opened his eyes. He had heard this before, Chloe's constant worrying. Her doctor had labeled the pregnancy high risk, and from that moment on, she had fretted over every twinge. She's just being dramatic, he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. She panics over nothing. She gets worked up about every little ache. But the text says she's bleeding, Serena noted, with a cool, observational tone. Maybe you should at least call. Julian reached out and silenced the phone, setting its screen down on the table. If it were a real emergency, her doctor would have called my work phone. She knows I have the beta launch going live tonight. Serena seemed to accept this with a little shrug. She hadn't spent much time thinking about the baby. Children were messy, inconvenient complications that diverted resources and focus better spent on one's career. She pressed herself against Julian, tracing a line down his stomach with her finger. You're probably right, she purred. She's just looking for attention. Now, where were we? Julian smiled and pulled her into an embrace, and 50 floors below, across a storm-swept city, his son was fighting for his life. The first spasm seized her at 10:45 p.m., a brutal, unwelcome clench. It felt like a violation. Arthur was downtown, he'd claimed, overseeing a critical concrete pour for his new skyscraper. He wasn't picking up. She called a ride share, her arm wrapped around her belly as the elevator descended from their penthouse. The trip to the hospital was a streak of Chicago's glittering, windswept streets, the hum of the electric car, a maddening drone marking the time. Clara stared at the dark, choppy waters of Lake Michigan, whispering to her unborn son, telling him to hold on, that his mother was with him, that they would be fine. But the pain was too sharp. The blood she'd seen was too bright. This was wrong. She pushed through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room at 11:03 p.m. A team in scrubs descended on her, their voices a storm of medical jargon that crashed over her in a wave of dread. A clerk with a clipboard tried to ask for her insurance card, her obstetrician's name, but she couldn't speak. "My son, please, you have to help my son." An older nurse, her eyes etched with kind lines, took Clara's hand. "We are going to give you the very best care," she said, her voice a solid anchor. "But we need to get you into an operating room this instant. We have to move now. Is that okay?" Clara could only force a strangled nod. The reality, a piece of glass lodged in her throat. A deep, invasive cold spread through her as they wheeled her down a sterile corridor, past gleaming steel carts and the quiet rush of the night staff. She tried Arthur's phone a final time. It went straight to his voicemail. She typed one last frantic text, her fingers trembling. "Arthur, please. I'm at Northwestern Memorial. Something is wrong with Theo. Call me." Asterisk, she prayed. She begged the universe. She pleaded for her son's life. At 11:32 p.m., the anesthesiologist lowered a mask over her mouth and nose. An insistent, steady beeping was the first thing she heard. It was the sound that would haunt the silence of her future. As her eyelids fluttered open, her doctor was standing beside the bed, his expression a careful mask of professional sympathy. He didn't need to speak. Clara could already feel the hollow, aching emptiness where her baby had been. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his tone soft, "I'm so terribly sorry. We tried everything we possibly could." Clara's legs felt like lead weights under the thin hospital blanket. She forced herself up, swinging them over the edge of the bed until her bare feet touched the cold tile floor. A raw, ragged sound ripped from her chest, the cry of a wounded animal that echoed into the silent hall. Her Theo, her sweet, long-awaited boy, gone. The Chicago hospital room was as quiet as a crypt at 2 a.m. Clara sat completely still, clutching a tiny blue knitted cap the nurse had left for him. It smelled of nothing. The phone on her bedside table glowed with a notification, not a text message, but an alert from the smart home app she rarely checked. A receipt had been forwarded to their shared household account. The title, Rush Catering Order, Peretti's Steakhouse. The delivery location was listed as Penthouse B, their firm's private corporate apartment, 2 floors below their own home. The stark white of the private room felt like an insult, a glaring spotlight on the new darkness in her life. She had opened the app only to check the building's security log to see if Arthur's car was in the garage. That's when she saw it. The log showed a guest, Isabel Croft, his lead designer, had been granted access to Penthouse B at 8:15 p.m. Then came the receipt for a $200 bottle of scotch. And finally, a misdirected photo that had just come through. Isabel, smiling, holding up a glass of champagne. In the reflection of the floor-to-ceiling window behind her, Clara could see Arthur raising his own glass in a toast. The timestamps on every entry, from 8 p.m. until after 1 a.m, perfectly matched the hours she had spent terrified and alone, losing their son. The sound she made wasn't a sob. It was the quiet, splintering crack of a heart breaking in two. He had ignored 8 texts and 5 phone calls while their son's fragile life faded away. 8 chances to be a husband, 5 chances to be a father, and he had chosen his project, his celebration, his protege. In that instant, Clara's suffocating grief began to change, crystallizing into something cold, sharp, and unbreakable. The void of her loss was still there, but a new structure was being built within it, one made of pure, focused resolve. She looked at the tiny blue cap the nurse had given her, the only physical piece she would ever have of Theo. She folded it with surgical precision and placed it in her handbag. By the time Arthur returned from his concrete pour, she would be ready. Arthur Vance walked into their Gold Coast penthouse just after 10 a.m., a faint scent of expensive scotch and the cold lake wind clinging to his coat. He had his story rehearsed, a sudden issue with the city inspectors, an all-night marathon session with the engineers, a strict no-phones policy to prevent leaks. He stopped short in the foyer. Clara was sitting in a high-backed chair by the window, the gray morning light over the lake turning her into a statue of sorrow. She was perfectly still, her hands resting over her now tragically, obviously empty womb. On the glass table beside her, her phone screen was lit. "Clara," Arthur started, his voice a perfect symphony of weary concern. "My God, I'm so sorry. The inspectors were tyrants. They made us put our phones in a lockbox. The meetings went on all night. By the time I could get service, I figured you were asleep. I didn't want to disturb you." Clara was silent. She just watched him, her eyes as gray and vast as the churning lake outside, completely empty of the admiration he had always fed on. He hesitated, her stillness throwing him off his script. He had prepared for tears, for anger, for a dramatic scene he knew how to navigate. "Is everything all right?" he finally asked, a note of real confusion in his tone. "The baby, he's all right, isn't he?" Clara finally moved her head, and her voice was a hollow whisper in the cavernous room. "Theo is gone. We lost him at 2:15 this morning, Arthur." His sculpted face tightened, the practiced worry replaced by a flicker of authentic shock. "What? I started having trouble last night. I sent you 8 texts. I called you 5 times. My call log shows every single one was delivered. Clara, my phone was secured. It was part of the inspection protocol. I swear, I didn't get anything until I left this morning. I thought the doctor said you just needed to rest. I thought he was fine." Clara slowly lifted a finger and tapped her phone screen, displaying the building's security log. It showed a clear, damning entry for the previous evening. Guest access. Granted, Croft, Penthouse B***. The corporate apartment. The one you told me was being renovated for the next 3 months. Arthur's composure finally fractured. She watched panic wrestle with his instinct for damage control. Damage control 1. It was for the investors. We had to do a final walkthrough to secure the next round of funding. Isabel had to be there with the final models. It's not what it seems. She swiped the screen again, showing him the steakhouse receipt. "To the new king of the skyline," she read from the custom note on the order, her voice completely flat. A thick, unbreathable silence filled the penthouse, a vacuum created where all his lies had just evaporated. He tried a different tactic, his voice shifting to the calm, condescending tone she now understood was his most dangerous tool. "You're in shock. You've been through something horrific, and you're looking for someone to blame. I get it. We can talk about this when you're feeling more yourself." Clara rose to her feet. She felt as if she had been carrying a mountain on her shoulders for years and had just set it down. "The nurse said he had my father's hands," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the sharp edge of steel. She told me our son died while I was alone, calling for his father, and you were 2 floors beneath our home, drinking scotch and celebrating with another woman. Arthur flinched, taking a half step back as if she'd slapped him. He had never seen this expression on her face. It was cool, assessing, and utterly devoid of fear. Clara, listen to me. You are not thinking straight. The grief is making you paranoid. Let me call Dr. Miller. We can get through this, but we have to do it together. Get out. The words were barely a whisper, but they cut through the air with the finality of a guillotine. This is my home, Arthur blustered, his arrogance rushing back to fill the empty space. I am not going anywhere. You are having an emotional breakdown. You need to rest. We will sort this all out tomorrow. Clara took one deliberate step toward him, forcing his eyes to meet hers. Before I launched the Arts Foundation, I spent 8 years as the lead investigative journalist for the Tribune, specializing in municipal corruption. I know exactly how you used 3 shell corporations to bribe the zoning commissioner to get your skyscraper approved. I have the unredacted wire transfers. I have the audio recording from my source inside the commissioner's office. I have the private cell numbers of 2 Pulitzer-winning reporters at the New York Times who would kill for that story. So when I tell you to get out, it is not a request, and you have until the sun sets on that lake to be gone before I demolish your entire world. Arthur just stared at her, the color draining from his face. For the first time since she'd met him, the great architect looked completely and utterly terrified. He grabbed his coat and was gone without saying another word. Clara watched the door close behind him. A moment later, her resolve crumbled, and she collapsed back into the armchair, clutching a small, rolled-up blueprint and pressing it to her cheek. She allowed herself 60 seconds of pure, unrestrained grief. 1 minute for a silent, shuddering sob to shake her entire body, to let herself completely break. Then she dried her tears, straightened her spine, and unlocked her phone. She navigated to a number she hadn't dialed in 5 years, a number Marcus had convinced her belonged to an overprotective, meddling man who couldn't comprehend their world. A single entry. Dad. Her thumb trembled over the screen, a flood of memories rushing back. Marcus's voice, always so persuasive, so confident. He doesn't get our ambition, Clara. He lives in the past. He's a government drone, Clara. A relic from a bygone age, Marcus had remarked, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. Your brother exists in a world of firewalls and security protocols. He'll never grasp the scale of what we're creating. If you want this future with me, you have to leave his paranoia behind. And she had chosen Marcus. It was the most catastrophic error she had ever made, but a mistake she could finally start to correct. Her finger hovered, then tapped the screen. The phone rang 3 times before a low, steady voice answered, a voice she hadn't heard in 2 years, a voice that sounded taken aback, but not surprised. Clara? Leo. Her own voice fractured. Marcus is gone, and I'm utterly alone. There was a brief pause, then, in a tone of sharp, controlled fury, I'll be there in an hour. Leo Thorne, the head of digital forensics for a major security consultancy in Canary Wharf, hung up and hailed a black cab. 90 minutes after her call, he was there. He had come directly from his office in the heart of London's financial district to her sprawling Kensington flat without a second thought. Clara opened the door to a brother who seemed more defined than she remembered. 2 years had sharpened his features and carved subtle lines of focus around his eyes, but his eyes were unchanged, observant, systematic, the eyes of a man who spent his life uncovering secrets hidden in lines of code. He absorbed his sister's shattered expression and enveloped her in a hug. In his arms, Clara finally let go. It was the first time she had truly cried since leaving the clinic. A brittle sort of shock had carried her through Marcus's return, his hollow excuses, the ensuing fight, and his final, callous departure. But embraced by her brother, Clara's defenses shattered. "I pushed you away," she wept, her voice muffled against the fabric of his suit. "For 2 years I believed him. When he said you were risk-averse, that I had to pick a side. I picked him, and now the baby's gone, and he didn't even stay." Leo just held her closer. "I saw what he was. I saw the system he was running, and watching him firewall you from your family was the most painful vulnerability I've ever witnessed." He gently guided her back, holding her face between his hands in a gesture he hadn't used since they were children. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice soft, "from the very beginning." And so she did. The affair she had suspected for months, the frightening cramps that had started that morning, the 20 ignored calls to his mobile, the notification on their shared smart home app for a bespoke sofa delivered to his private studio in Shoreditch, a piece she had never laid eyes on. Marcus's flimsy lies, quickly followed by his cold, dismissive rage. When she was done, Leo remained silent for a long moment, his jaw clenched, his eyes acquiring a cold, analytical gleam. Clara knew that look. It was the one he wore when he located a critical exploit in a supposedly secure network. "What is it you want to do?" he asked at last. Clara met his gaze directly. The grief was a tangible weight within her, but over the last few hours, it had been forged into something unyielding and sharp. "I want to dismantle him," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Everything. His startup, his venture capital, his reputation as a genius. I want him to know what it feels like to have it all erased." Leo gave a short, decisive nod. "Then that is what we'll do. We will be surgical. We will be untraceable. And we will leave him with a valuation of 0. No rash moves. No emotional outbursts. We map his entire digital infrastructure. We secure the data. We construct the case. And when we are done, Marcus Thorne will be a footnote in the tech industry." Leo spoke with the calm authority he used when briefing clients on a corporate espionage case. Methodical, pragmatic, and final. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Clara felt a small, delicate spark of something she feared was lost forever: strength. "How?" she breathed. Leo opened his laptop, revealing not a hacker's terminal, but a complex, sprawling map of interconnected servers, cloud accounts, and hidden crypto wallets, the digital battlefield of a cybersecurity expert. "First, we need legal representation. You were a lead architect at a top firm before you left to design his headquarters. Do you still know anyone from your former life who can help us?" Clara thought for a moment. One name rose to the surface instantly. "Zara Chaudhry," she said. "My flatmate from Cambridge. She's a Queen's Counsel now, specializes in financial fraud. One of the best barristers in London." Leo's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Flatmate? I don't recall you speaking of her in at least 4 years." A feeling of shame washed over her. "I let it fade," Clara admitted. "Marcus said she was too aggressive, that her ambition was off-putting. He said she was a toxic influence, so I just let her go." "And you think she will take your case now?" Clara recalled Zara's fierce loyalty, her inability to back down from a fight, and the polite but unwavering birthday messages she'd sent long after Clara had stopped replying. "Yes, I'm certain of it." "Excellent. Contact her," Leo said, his attention already back on the screen. "Next, leverage. You mentioned signing documents for angel investor portfolios. Do you have copies?" "I have some of them. Digital copies of the initial contracts and a few transaction confirmations I saved. But he kept all the hard copies in the office safe." I only learned about Serafina because my husband, Marcus, forgot. Our smart home system was linked to my phone. A notification popped up from his private Shoreditch studio, an alert that synced to our family account. It read, Serafina's comfort heating schedule has been activated. That was the instant I knew I had to uncover his entire hidden world, his shadow investors, his startup's true burn rate, everything. My brother Leo gave me a calm, focused look I hadn't seen in years. It's a fortunate coincidence, he said, that my entire profession is built on recovering the data people think they've deleted. I hesitated. Is this going to get complicated? Leo's expression was unreadable. We can deal with the consequences after we've secured the evidence. 3 days later, I was walking into the ancient, wood-paneled building of a London legal chambers. The space between me and my old friend was heavy, with 4 years of silence and a friendship I had thrown away. Zara Chaudhry looked every inch the formidable London barrister. Her suit was impeccably tailored, and she carried an air of absolute self-possession. But the moment she saw me, 7 months pregnant and looking like I could break at any moment, her professional guard vanished. Her eyes widened. "Clara," she whispered, "oh my word, I knew you were expecting. I am so unbelievably happy for you." She moved from behind her enormous desk and gave me a hug that erased 4 years of my own guilt and neglect. We sat in her chambers, the quiet of the legal district around us, speaking in hushed tones over glasses of water we never touched. "I need your help, Zara," I finally managed. "And not just as a friend, I need the best financial crime barrister in the city. Everyone I spoke to said that was you." Zara nodded slowly, her expression shifting, becoming sharp and analytical. "I can handle a contentious divorce, Clara, but judging by the look in your eyes, I suspect this involves something more." I pushed a memory stick across the polished wood of her desk. On it was the data I had, the smart home logs, bank records showing enormous questionable transfers, and the documents Leo had told me to find. "Marcus had me sign things," I explained, my voice barely audible. "He called them seed investments. For our future, for our child. I never doubted him. I trusted him without question. But now, I believe they were something else entirely." Zara inserted the stick into her computer, and with every file she opened, the concerned friend retreated and the brilliant prosecutor she once was came into view. "These aren't seed investments," she said at last, her voice dangerously quiet. "These are director appointment forms for more than a dozen offshore entities registered in the British Virgin Islands. Clara, if this data is authentic, your husband has been using your digital signature to make you the sole director of a network of shell companies." "What does that mean?" I asked, a wave of cold dread washing over me. "It means we have to discover what those companies were for, because if he was using them for something illegal, like laundering investor money, or hiding assets from His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, your signature makes you the liable party. Legally, that makes you his accomplice." The blood drained from my face. So he wasn't just cheating on me, he was framing me to take the fall. That is precisely how it appears. Clara's hand covered mine on the cold glass of her conference table. "But this is also how we take him down. If we can prove he misled you, that you had no idea about his criminal dealings, we can flip this entire narrative. He's no longer the brilliant developer. He becomes the man who built a fraudulent empire using his pregnant wife as a shield." "But how do we prove it?" I asked, my voice thin. "We start by creating a full forensic map of his business. Every LLC you put your name on, every property he bought and sold through them. We follow the money, and we hire a forensic accountant who is an absolute shark." I drew in a long, shaky breath, feeling a new, cold kind of determination. "I can do that," My brother is already digging through his company's servers. Your brother? Clara looked shocked. I thought you and Leo weren't on speaking terms. A muscle in my jaw tightened. We weren't. But finding out that your brother-in-law is a pathological liar who is setting up his pregnant wife to take the fall for racketeering has a funny way of mending fences. Clara was quiet for a moment, then squeezed my hand. I told you back in law school that there was something about Marcus that felt empty, she said softly. You told me I was just being jaded. I know, I whispered, the words thick with regret. Clara, I'm so incredibly sorry. Don't be sorry, she said, her voice turning to ice. Be ready, because I'm going to help you burn his entire world to the ground. Clara's gaze was sharp, clinical. We're going to tear this apart piece by piece. Whatever is coming, I'm right here with you. It was the first moment since I'd seen that misdirected email that I felt anything besides a vast, crushing void. I felt the strength of a friendship I was sure I had let wither away, the solid power of a connection that had been stretched to its limit, but had refused to break. Thank you, I breathed, my voice thick with tears I refused to shed. Clara offered a grim smile. Save your thanks. Thank me when we get a court order that freezes every last asset in that monster's real estate empire. The financial deep dive took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of my life spent decoding offshore bank statements and holding hushed, encrypted video calls with Clara's team of cybersecurity analysts and financial investigators. I became a different person over those 2 weeks. The weeping stopped. I started eating again, forcing myself into disciplined 2-hour sleep cycles, functioning like a machine. The woman I had been before was simply gone, some essential part of my spirit scorched away. The ache was still a constant weight in my chest, but it had calcified into something useful, a kind of armor. With the cold precision of an art curator cataloging an exhibit, I deconstructed the last 4 years of my life, listing every time Marcus had casually handed me his tablet, saying, Sweetheart, just need you to sign off on this zoning application. It's for the new waterfront tower. Every late-night document I had been too trusting, too weary to ever second-guess. I remembered him setting up new corporate structures he called our family trust. I recalled being half asleep, placing my complete faith in my husband as I tapped approve on the screen without a single thought. He had taken my trust and twisted it into a weapon to be used against me. At the same time, my father started making inquiries. His old colleagues from his days on the City Planning Commission were now senior partners at firms that specialized in tracing illegal development funds. In only 10 days, they had legally pieced together a 5-year map of Marcus's corporate dealings. The picture it revealed made me feel physically sick. A sprawling network of shell companies, all registered, using my name and social security number, were being used to funnel bribes to corrupt city officials in exchange for rubber-stamping zoning changes for his high-rises. The payment records showed sums of hundreds of thousands of dollars moving to anonymous accounts just days before a critical zoning variance for one of his flagship towers was approved. He's been bribing city officials for years, my father said, his voice grave over the secure line. The real question is, who else is on his payroll? Is it just him? Or does this conspiracy go all the way to the top of the planning department? I stared at the flow charts, my former life as an art curator, feeling like it belonged to someone else entirely. Some of these payments are strange, I noted, my eye for patterns catching a discrepancy. Look, this one was sent to a holding company in Nevis a week before a rival developer's project was suddenly blocked by red tape. Marcus had no direct involvement in that project, which implies he has allies who are also working against his competitors, my father concluded. That was a problem for another day. For now, we had more than enough. 2 weeks after I first saw that email, I was in Clara's high-rise San Francisco office, looking at a mountain of digital evidence. Proof of bribery, decrypted texts outlining his affair with Nina, a junior architect at his firm, and the most damning piece of it all, hotel receipts and credit card statements that Clara's team had pulled from his company expense reports. The phone's location data pinpointed Marcus's exact movements on the night I'd had a pregnancy complication 2 months ago. I had been calling him over and over as my sister rushed me to the emergency room. On the monitor, Clara replayed the timeline. It showed him at a luxury resort in Napa. It showed my name flashing on his phone, call after unanswered call. And it showed him silencing every single one. He then sent a text to Nina. Small issue with the blueprints, taking care of it. He knew, I said, my voice unnervingly steady. He knew I was terrified and on my way to the hospital, and he chose her over me. Clara nodded, her expression hardening with a quiet fury. This, combined with the financial fraud, is everything we need to destroy him. Are you ready for me to file? I looked at the data spread across the screen, all the agony and betrayal condensed into spreadsheets and legal briefs. I thought about the baby growing inside me, about the life I now had to rebuild from nothing. I thought of every lie he ever told about a late night at the office. File everything, I said, my voice like stone. Clara reached for her desk phone, but just as her finger hovered over the keypad, my own phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I read it, and a wave of ice washed through me. You should have stayed out of the waterfront project. The message was blunt. Back off. You have no idea who you're messing with. I showed the phone to Clara, my lawyer, who read it with a sharp frown. That isn't Marcus's style, I said, a slight tremor in my voice. He uses lawsuits and corporate intimidation, not this kind of back-alley threat. This is from someone else, one of the officials he's paying. Have you told anyone at his company about this? Clara asked. No one. This has to be linked to whoever sent me the original tip about the misdirected email. Clara put her phone back in its cradle. Do you want to wait? Perhaps we should rethink our strategy. I thought about it for less than a heartbeat before my resolve turned to steel. Not a chance. We're filing at 9 in the morning tomorrow, I announced. Running won't protect me from him or from whoever this is. We push forward, we move fast, and we find out who the real kingpin is in this whole scheme. Clara's professional demeanor cracked, and she gave a sharp, approving smile. There's the Evelyn I remember, she said. It's good to have you back. We filed the divorce papers that Thursday. By Friday night, my world had imploded for the second time. It began with a sharp, authoritative knock on the door of my townhouse. Two people, a man and a woman, in plain, dark suits, stood on my porch, holding up FBI badges. Mrs. Sterling? I'm Agent Miller. And I'm Agent Davis. We need to ask you some questions regarding a series of real estate development LLCs. My blood went cold. I recognized the names they listed. They were the shell corporations my father had uncovered. What about them? I was able to ask, my voice barely a whisper. You're listed as the primary officer and signatory on all their legal documents, Agent Miller said, his voice flat and detached. We've identified a pattern of suspicious wire transfers moving through these accounts, all of which coincide with key city zoning votes. I don't know anything about that, I said. My husband told me they were for holding titles for investment properties, just standard corporate procedure. We hear that quite a bit, Mrs. Sterling. Agent Davis spoke then, his tone laced with disbelief. May we come inside? I wanted to slam the door in their faces, to scream for Clara, for my father, for anybody, but I understood how refusing entry to federal agents would be perceived. Yes, of course, I said, moving aside. Please come in. They questioned me for what felt like an eternity, though the clock on the mantelpiece insisted it was only 4 hours. By the time they departed, I felt completely hollowed out. They had everything, digital records with my e-signature on them, authorizing the transfer of hundreds of thousands of dollars to offshore accounts just before favorable zoning decisions were passed on Marcus's projects. They had built a perfect, airtight case for conspiracy and bribery, and I was the one they planned to lock up. As the storage unit's metal door clanged shut, I leaned against the cold wall, my legs giving out. Arthur hadn't just been having an affair. He hadn't just abandoned me during a high-risk pregnancy. He had spent years methodically constructing a labyrinth of financial fraud, with my name forged at every turn, designing me to be the sole scapegoat. My phone vibrated. A banking alert. A transfer of $10 million from our portfolio to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands was complete. A second notification popped up. An email from our private travel consultant, accidentally forwarded to me. It confirmed 2 one-way tickets to Grand Cayman, departing from a private airfield in an hour. The passengers were Arthur and his lead architect, a woman named Isabel. A courier found Catherine at her sister's much smaller townhouse. Arthur Kensington was filing for divorce and seeking sole custody of their unborn child, citing her emotional instability and financial recklessness as a danger to the baby. The petition was thick with sworn statements from people she'd once called friends, executives from Arthur's real estate firm. Men and women she'd hosted for countless dinners were now on record describing her as prone to paranoid delusions and manic spending. Her phone buzzed. It was her lawyer, Maria. Catherine, we have a serious situation. I see that. He's trying to steal my son. It's far more sinister than that, Maria said, her voice sharp with urgency. Arthur filed from offshore this morning. He's way ahead of us on the narrative, and the story he's selling is pure poison. What story? He's claiming your new restaurant venture, the one he supposedly funded, was a catastrophic failure due to your incompetence, that you've incurred massive secret debts, and that he is the victim, forced to flee the country to protect his assets from your erratic behavior. He has his entire board of directors lined up to commit perjury for him. That's certifiably insane. I put my career as a Michelin-starred chef on hold for 2 years to support his downtown skyscraper project. I schmoozed investors. I planned the galas. Arthur was the one who was never there. I know that, Catherine, and we will fight it. But his version is already the headline on every financial news site in Chicago. Marcus's father, a retired judge who still holds immense power in this city, is on the phone with every bank, every investor. The entire establishment is circling the wagons around him, not you. Evelyn rubbed her temples, trying to fight off a spike of dizziness. So I'm the hysterical one. Precisely, the hormonal pregnant artist who flew too close to the sun, the bitter wife looking for revenge after he left her. He's even planting the story that you were the one pushing for the risky investments that are now under federal investigation. He's methodically destroying your reputation before you can even issue a denial. How can I fight a story like that? We don't fight his story. We tell our own, the truth. We use the offshore wire transfers, the secret ledgers, the recordings from his former CFO. We build a fortress of facts, and we leak it to a national investigative journalist before he can spin it any further, her brother Daniel added, his voice like steel. But this is where it gets dangerous. If the SEC believes for a second that you were a willing party to his scheme, you're the one facing conspiracy and fraud charges. Our only job right now is to prove he manipulated you, that you had no idea he was using your art gallery as a front to launder money from foreign oligarchs. How long will that take? Impossible to say. Weeks if we're lucky, months more likely. Evelyn stared at the water stains on the ceiling of her cramped new apartment. A month ago, she was designing a nursery in a sprawling Lincoln Park mansion, married to a charismatic tech mogul, living a life she thought was a dream. Now she was facing a brutal divorce, being framed as the mastermind of a federal crime, and enduring a public character assassination designed to utterly ruin her. "My brother," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Have you spoken to him?" "He called me an hour ago. He's on his way. He said to tell you to hold the line." "What's he doing?" "He wouldn't say, and I didn't ask. But Evelyn, I clerked for Daniel Kane for 3 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office. That man doesn't make threats. He writes indictments. Whatever he's planning, a lot of powerful people are about to have a very bad year." "God, I hope so," Evelyn breathed out. "I really, truly hope so." The following 2 weeks were the most isolating Evelyn had ever experienced. The official divorce petition arrived, along with an emergency court order freezing every asset tied to her name, leaving her completely cut off. Marcus's legal team deposed her for 8 hours in a sterile boardroom, where every question was a thinly veiled accusation. A profound social chill followed her everywhere. Old friends from the gallery world would suddenly find something fascinating on the other side of the street when she approached. At a museum benefit, the wife of a major art collector blocked her path near the coat check. "I've heard what you're trying to do to Marcus," she hissed, just loud enough for the people nearby to turn their heads. He is a visionary who is changing the face of technology in this city. And you're trying to tear him down with this pathetic drama. You should be ashamed." Evelyn didn't say a word. She handed her champagne flute to a passing server, turned away from the woman, and walked out of the museum, her back straight, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. But later, in the suffocating quiet of her new apartment, her composure shattered. She slid to the floor in the empty room that should have been a nursery, clutching the fuzzy 3D ultrasound photo of her daughter, and sobbed until she was hollowed out. When the tears stopped, she just sat in the dark. She wondered if this was how her life ended, not with a valiant fight for justice, but with a slow, silent surrender. Her phone buzzed on the floor, a text from her brother. "5 minutes out. We're changing the game plan." 30 minutes later, Daniel Kane walked into the apartment and found his sister looking like a ghost. He didn't offer empty platitudes or promise that things would be okay. He just pulled a chair to face her, his gaze as sharp and dissecting as it was in front of a grand jury. "You are making the single biggest mistake of every defendant I've ever prosecuted," he stated, his voice calm and clinical. "You're confusing the loss of your current position with the loss of the entire war." Evelyn just shook her head, unable to speak. "He has it all, Daniel. The money, the connections, the best PR firm in the country, spinning his lies. The whole world thinks I'm a vindictive monster. I have nothing." "Nothing?" Her brother leaned in, his voice dropping. "You have me. You have the unshakable truth. And you have leverage. Marcus Sterling is too arrogant and insulated to even conceive of." "I did not spend 15 years taking down organized crime syndicates in New York to let some slick tech bro with a god complex destroy my sister. We are done playing his game, Evelyn. We are going to play ours. And our game is scorched earth." "How?" A rare, chilling smile touched her brother's lips. "We dismantle his support structure. We make every single person enabling him realize that their loyalty comes at the cost of their own freedom. By the time we are finished, Marcus Sterling will be a pariah with no allies, no capital, and no credibility left in this country. And that is when he will finally learn what it feels like to have absolutely nothing. The conference room at a top Chicago law firm was a sterile space of glass and chrome overlooking the river. Daniel Kane sat at the head of a long table with a bottle of water. Across from him sat two men, the chief risk officer for the bank that held all of Marcus's corporate loans and the influential chairman of the city's Landmarks Commission. "Gentlemen," Daniel began, his tone disarmingly pleasant, "thank you for coming. I know you both have a significant professional stake in the success of Marcus Sterling's new tech campus." The banker, a man named Peterson, gave a slight cautious nod. "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Kane. When a federal prosecutor asks for a meeting, it's wise to accept. What can we do for you, Mr. Kane? It is more about what I can do for both of you." Daniel slid two identical, thick binders across the polished table. "It has come to my office's attention that there are significant criminal vulnerabilities within the Sterling organization, specifically a pattern of bank fraud and bribery related to his latest project, all personally directed by Marcus Sterling." The two men exchanged a brief, imperceptible glance. Daniel noted the sudden rigidity in their shoulders. "What sort of vulnerabilities?" The chairman, a man named Hayes, asked, his voice now flat. Daniel tapped one of the binders. "Fraudulent environmental impact statements used to secure nine-figure loans from your bank, Mr. Peterson, and a series of untraceable payments to a shell corporation owned by your nephew, Mr. Hayes, in exchange for fast-tracking zoning variances." A dead silence filled the room. "Now," Daniel continued, his voice softening, "I am not for a moment suggesting either of you were aware of the specifics of Marcus's crimes. I am certain you are just as appalled as I am to learn that the man you have both publicly endorsed has been using your institutions and your good names to commit multiple federal felonies. Model." "If that's the case," Arthur said, his tone turning to frost, "why come to us? Why not take this directly to the district attorney? Because I believe in allowing professionals to contain their own disasters before they go nuclear. And because prosecutors, when they catch a scent like this, they don't just stop at one person. They won't just take down Julian. They'll start digging into why a cutting-edge tech firm's board approved such massive, unaudited expenditures, and why its celebrated CEO was funneling company money into a competitor's art gallery." The unspoken threat was precise and devastatingly clear. Jessica Thorne's jaw was a rigid line. It looked like it might crack under the pressure. "What is it you want, Sterling?" she asked, the cordial pretense now completely gone. Arthur met her stare without flinching. "My conditions are straightforward. I want Julian Croft to resign from his position as CEO. He'll cite personal health reasons. It will be effective immediately. I want the consulting contract for his strategist, Ava Monroe, terminated. And I want a binding agreement ensuring my daughter's financial security and that her name is never, under any circumstances, tied to this mess. And if we say no, then this entire dossier, complete with encrypted transaction logs, goes to the tech desk at the Wall Street Journal, and their reporters would absolutely feast on a story about corruption at the top of Chicago's tech darling. But I suspect the two people who stand to lose the most from that kind of public implosion are sitting in this very room." Jessica held his gaze for a long, heavy moment before reaching for the folder and flipping it open. Arthur leaned back in his chair, watching as the blood drained from their faces while they scanned the offshore bank transfers and damning private messages. At last, Jessica looked up at her partner. A silent, grim acknowledgement passed between them. "We'll need to verify this," her partner said, his voice a low growl. "By all means," Arthur said, rising from his seat. "I wouldn't expect anything less. But I suggest you verify it with haste. Information like this tends to become volatile if it isn't managed properly." He walked to the door, then paused. "And one last thing, for clarity. My daughter is pregnant with my first grandchild." Mr. Croft was liquidating their joint assets to bankroll his affair with Miss Monroe, his partner in this little scheme. "So when I say I want him out, I hope you appreciate that I am exercising an almost superhuman level of professional courtesy." He left. 2 days later, Julian Croft strode into the gleaming, minimalist lobby of Ether Technologies, only to be intercepted by two impassive men from building security. "Mr. Croft," the chief of security said, his voice flat and empty, "we're going to need you to come with us." "What's this about?" "The board has a few questions regarding the Project Nightingale budget." Julian's easy confidence wavered for a moment as they guided him toward a small, private conference room, not the executive elevator. He felt the office chatter die around him, saw how the junior engineers suddenly became obsessed with their code, the way his own executive assistant was now studying her shoes as if they held the secrets of the universe. Inside the sterile glass room, the two lead board members were waiting, their faces set like granite. Julian, one of them, Robert said, his voice stripped of its usual camaraderie, "Have a seat. What in the hell is going on? The board has accepted your resignation, effective immediately, pending a full forensic audit into a series of significant financial irregularities within the company." Julian's face turned ashen. "That's absurd. Whatever you think you've found, there is a perfectly reasonable explanation for it." "I have no doubt there is," Robert countered. "But until our auditors find that reason, you are severed from the company. Your network access, your key card, and your corporate expense accounts have all been disabled. Security will escort you to your office to retrieve your personal items, and then they will escort you from the premises. You can't do this." "We have." The company's lawyer slid a tablet across the sleek table, displaying the formal acceptance of his non-negotiable resignation. "If you intend to fight this, I recommend you speak with your legal counsel, though I would strongly advise you not to make a scene. Tech journalists get very interested when a founder and CEO is physically removed from his own headquarters." Julian's gaze shot from the glowing screen to the stone-faced board members, then to the two imposing guards standing by the door. For the first time, a wave of raw panic washed over him. "This isn't over," he snarled, grabbing his coat. "You have no idea what you've just started." Perhaps the other board member, Maria, replied, her tone like ice. "But for now, we are simply cleaning our own house. Have a good afternoon, Mr. Croft." Clara learned about Julian's ousting from a steady, composed call from her father. "It's a coup! They're stealing my company from me," he had screamed into her voicemail. She deleted it after the first few seconds and dialed her father. "How did you know they would move so fast?" "I simply illuminated a clear and present danger to their IPO, Clara. They made their own decision about how to handle the infection. What's our next step? Now, we let him flounder. Julian will become desperate. He will reach out to his allies, his partner in crime, anyone he believes can save him, and our people will be listening to every word. That is how we'll learn the true scope of his betrayal. And my financial stake in the company? Your lawyers are building a fortress around your assets, but Clara, our investigator, Elias, has submitted his preliminary report. The shell corporation they used to acquire that sculpture was the loose thread that's letting us unravel everything. Incredible work. But can he argue he wasn't part of it? We can prove he was. We have the digital payment authorizations and server logs that put him at the very heart of the scheme. What we don't have yet is proof of who was directing him. My team is on it. Clara took a slow, deliberate breath. For the first time in months, she felt as if she could actually fill her lungs with air. Thank you, Dad. Don't thank me just yet. This is only the beginning. The next critical piece of the puzzle arrived from a direction she had never once considered. Elias called Clara 3 days after Julian was fired, his voice tight with an urgency she'd never heard from him. I've been doing a deep dive into Ava Monroe's background, he began, and I have something that changes everything. What is it? She isn't just Julian's mistress. She is the mastermind behind this entire operation. What are you talking about? I'm telling you, she targeted Julian like a hunter stalking prey. This started years ago. She created an entire dossier on him, long before they ever met. She knew his position at Ether, she knew about your family, and the Sterling Gallery's reputation. Why? Because this isn't her first time orchestrating corporate espionage. Just a different alias, a different city, a different target. I've connected her digital footprint to 2 other similar cases of intellectual property theft. Clara, Ava Monroe is a completely fabricated persona. We have no earthly idea who she really is. There's a sealed juvenile record for a massive insider trading case out of Berlin from over a decade ago. She wiped her past clean and built an entirely new identity. Clara felt the sickening, cold logic of it all snap into focus. So Julian was never in charge. Julian was the tool, a key she could use to unlock any door she wanted. Ava's been playing a global game of corporate chess, and he thought he was the king. But why Ether? Our family isn't in tech. Julian is wealthy, but he's not a titan. Your father, Elias's voice became grim. She targeted Julian to get to you, and she targeted you to get to Arthur Sterling. Your father's name was built on acquiring struggling galleries and turning them around. Someone with an old score to settle and very deep pockets would see hiring a professional like her as the perfect, untraceable revenge. Clara sank back into the sofa cushions. She had thought Julian was the enemy. She was wrong. Julian was just the bullet. The real shooter was a ghost she had never even seen. Does my father know about this? He's being briefed right now. And Clara, he is incandescent with rage. I can imagine. There's more. That offshore account they set up to funnel the embezzled funds. A massive portion of the money has just been transferred to a secondary, anonymous crypto wallet. A wallet that shares a digital marker with one of Ava's previous operations. She's been siphoning money from their own stolen money. Julian probably has no idea. So her endgame was to bankrupt his company, destroy my family's reputation, and then disappear with the tech and the money, leaving Julian to take the entire fall. That seems to be the play, yes. Clara shut her eyes. The sheer audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. She had almost lost her child, her marriage, her family's good name, and her own peace of mind, all because of a phantom she never knew was there. What do we do now? Now, Elias said, we let them tear each other apart, and then we just watch it burn. The strategy was brutally simple. Ava had manipulated Julian for years, stroking his ego and feeding his ambition, while he remained convinced that every move was his own brilliant idea. All Clara and her team needed to do was reveal the puppeteer's hand. His own towering narcissism and desperate need for self-preservation would do all the work for them. It began with a single, strategically leaked screenshot. Digital bait designed to look like an inside tip from a source at a cryptocurrency exchange. It was discreetly sent to a tech blogger that Julian, in his frantic search for a way to clear his name, was certain to be monitoring. Every file within the hidden partition painted the same damning picture. Juliana wasn't his partner in crime. She was the architect of the entire conspiracy, poised to cut him loose and vanish with their illicitly gained political capital. Leo, in his typical fashion, responded with raw, betrayed fury. Their final clash took place in her minimalist, glass-walled office overlooking the San Francisco Bay. Leo stormed in, a laptop open to show encrypted chat logs, his features contorted in a mask of pure rage. "You've been using my company as a slush fund," he snarled. "This whole time, you've been fabricating consulting fees to funnel dark money into your campaigns. You were positioning me to be the sole target of an FEC investigation." Juliana, however, remained perfectly composed. She had anticipated this exact scenario. "Anticipated what, my love? Your imagination is getting the better of you. Whatever fabricated logs you believe you've found, I'm positive there's a rational explanation." "Explain this," he shot back, shoving the laptop at her. It displayed a labyrinth of offshore transactions, ghost donor lists, and a clear money trail leading to a crypto wallet he'd never even known existed. Juliana gave the screen a dismissive glance, her calm facade unbroken, but a subtle flicker in her gaze gave her away. She was already processing, adapting her strategy to this unexpected variable. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her tone dangerously soft. "Does it even matter? You've been playing me for a fool from the start. Every compromise I made, every line I crossed, it was all so you could build your political machine and leave me to take the fall. Was any of this real? Or was I just the tech CEO with the deep pockets you needed to exploit?" Juliana set the laptop down on a sleek chrome desk and faced him, her expression shifting into one of practiced sorrow. "Oh, Leo, you've always struggled to see the bigger picture, haven't you? Everything I orchestrated was to build our future. The strategy was always to amass enough influence and then disappear, moving to a place where we would be completely untouchable together." "Together?" Leo barked out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You were meticulously crafting a data trail that pointed directly to my pregnant wife's charity. You were going to let me go to prison so you could walk away with a kingmaker's reputation. I was creating plausible deniability, Leo, not a prison cell for you. There's a significant difference. Your wife's foundation provided the perfect cover. Her digital signatures are on every initial transfer authorization. Clara is the one the federal investigators will tear apart. When this whole thing collapses, she's the one who gets indicted, and we walk away with unprecedented power. And the crypto wallet? A small contingency fund, just in case you suddenly grew a conscience." Juliana moved closer, her voice dropping to a seductive whisper. "But it doesn't have to end this way. We can still have everything. The life we always talked about." Leo just stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of betrayal and lingering attraction. Clara's private investigator, monitoring the conversation from a surveillance van across the street, held his breath, wondering if Leo's ambition would win out over his instinct for self-preservation. It didn't. "I trusted you," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "I dismantled my entire ethical code for you. I was prepared to scorch the earth for you. And all along, your plan was to bleed me dry and abandon me to the authorities. Leo, please, just listen to me. No." He backed away toward the door. "I'm finished. From this point forward, you are completely on your own." Then he was gone. Juliana stared at the space he had just occupied, her cool, calculated expression finally cracking to reveal the cold, terrifying fury simmering beneath. Leo went directly to the board of Nexus AI. He explained the entire scheme, the plot to use company funds for illegal campaign contributions, the fabricated consulting invoices, the secret crypto wallet, and he told them everything about Juliana Croft and her notorious history of leveraging tech executives to orchestrate political coups. He painted himself as the ultimate victim, a man manipulated and ruined by a seductive and ruthless political operator. The board sat in shocked silence, recording his entire confession before immediately contacting the Department of Justice. 2 days later, federal agents intercepted Juliana Croft at a Silicon Valley tech summit, just as she was walking off stage after delivering the keynote address. They didn't find a woman prepared to run. They found her absorbing the thunderous applause. They took her into custody right there in the main auditorium, in front of 1,000 of her colleagues and the giants of the tech industry. The flash of a dozen smartphone cameras blinded her for a second, the light bouncing off the floor-to-ceiling windows of her high-rise office. In seconds, the images were trending worldwide. Juliana Croft, the infamous political fixer, her face a mask of cold fury, as a federal agent presented her with a warrant. The news exploded across tech blogs and news networks. Silicon Valley was in an uproar. From the comfort of her Pacific Heights home, Clara watched it unfold. Her best friend Ben, a lead journalist for a major tech publication, by her side. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a wave of immense relief washed over her. "It's done," she whispered. "It has to be, doesn't it? Your article went viral. Leo gave the feds everything they needed. She's finished." Ben nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen. "It certainly looks that way." "They have completely accepted the story that your foundation was her main tool for the scheme. Our source's data trail proves it. The encrypted messages, the money laundered through a half-dozen shell corporations. So, I'm safe, you're safe." Clara exhaled a breath she felt she'd been holding for a year. The immense pressure on her heart finally beginning to ease. Her eyes fell to a framed sonogram photo on the mantel, a small, perfect outline. "I protected you, my sweet baby," she whispered. "It's all over now." But it wasn't over. 2 days later, Clara's phone vibrated. It was Ben, and his voice was tight with disbelief. The DOJ just dropped the entire case against Juliana. What? Their key witness, the chief financial officer from Leo's company, he recanted his testimony. He's now claiming he falsified all the documents you leaked to the press, every single file. He says he was coerced. The digital evidence has been ruled inadmissible by a federal judge, who is questioning how it was obtained. A judge she has in her pocket declared it fruit of the poisonous tree. That's not possible. How could she manage that? I have no idea. But Juliana is walking free. And Clara, there's more. What could possibly be more? She knows it was you. She knows you're the one who figured it all out and fed me the story. And Juliana Croft is not the kind of person who just lets something like that go. Clara fell back onto the sofa, the fragile piece she had just found shattering into a million pieces. She's coming for me. She's coming for us both. Whatever leverage she has, whatever powerful people owe her favors, she's going to call them all in to ruin us. What are we going to do? We fight back, Clara. It's the only thing we can do. The retaliation began only hours later. Clara was at a doctor's appointment, trying to focus on the powerful, steady whoosh of her baby's heartbeat on the ultrasound monitor, when her phone buzzed with an alert. A prominent tech journalist, Ben Carter, had been suspended indefinitely for fabricating sources and gross professional misconduct. The report cited an unnamed senior editor from his own publication. Clara felt the color drain from her face. She's taking out our only public voice, she thought, her hands starting to tremble. The doctor gave her a worried look. "Mrs. Vance, is everything okay? Your blood pressure just shot up significantly." "Don't let her win," Leo had begged her. "You have to finish this." But how was she supposed to do that now? The doctor's words about the risks of severe stress on the baby were ringing in her ears. Her best friend, and her key to shaping the public narrative, was now sidelined, fighting for his own reputation. Clara felt cornered, the serene, sterile walls of the exam room suddenly feeling like they were shrinking around her. She was utterly alone. Except She wasn't. Not entirely. Her phone buzzed again. It was a call from their family's lawyer, Arthur Finch. Clara steeled herself for more bad news, and it came exactly as she expected. I have to officially withdraw as legal counsel for your foundation, Clara. His voice was toneless, all its usual confidence gone. What? No, Arthur. You've represented my family for 30 years. Juliana has me in an impossible position. An IPO I managed over a decade ago had some irregularities, things that I was assured would remain buried forever. If I don't recuse myself, she has threatened to send the entire unedited file to the state's attorney general. She will ruin my firm, my name, everything I have spent a lifetime building. Please, you promised you would help us get through this. There was a long, agonizing pause on the line before the old lawyer spoke again, his voice heavy with shame. I am so very sorry, Clara. I wish I had the strength to take her on, but I don't. I have a family, a reputation. I can't throw it all away for this fight. I see, Eleanor said, her voice steady, while a chilling rage crystallized within her, a sense of being utterly and completely cast adrift. Thank you for all your work. I hope she gets exactly what's coming to her, Eleanor, he replied, his voice barely audible. I truly do. The call ended. Eleanor remained perched on the edge of a drafting table, the quiet hum of the server room the only sound in her architecture studio. Her closest confidant was professionally ruined. Her lawyer had just abandoned her, and her enemy was ascendant, more powerful than ever, with her sights now set squarely on Eleanor. She had never felt so profoundly and terrifyingly isolated. The studio, with its clean lines and awards for innovative design, suddenly felt like a mausoleum. The vision boards showcasing future projects seemed like relics from a forgotten civilization. Her entire counter-strategy had been vaporized. Sloane was untouchable. Julian was now the sole target of the fraud investigation, his accusations of being manipulated now dismissed as the desperate lies of a man trying to save his own skin. The trove of documents they had compiled was now locked away under court seal or ruled inadmissible. Every path forward was a brick wall, and Sloane was just getting started with her retribution. The attacks began that afternoon, a coordinated digital assault. Each one was a perfectly engineered piece of psychological warfare. A press release announcing a hostile takeover bid for the Caldwell Group. A series of deep fake audio clips of her father, making it sound like he was confessing to financial crimes. A meticulously crafted proposal for the demolition of her flagship building, sent directly to the city's top investors. Did you really think you could win against me? A short, encrypted message read. Your husband is a pariah. Your allies are gone. Who's left to protect you? I will tear down everything your family ever built, and I'll make sure you're sitting in the front row to watch it burn. Eleanor instructed her, IT director, to block every known shell company and blacklist Sloane's domains, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. She knew that any sign of panic would be a victory for her opponent, proof that the campaign of intimidation was landing its punches. Eleanor wouldn't give her that. But later that night, alone in the dark, silent nursery, the first real cracks appeared in her composure. What was the point of it all? She had risked everything, fought with every fiber of her being, and it had all come to nothing. Julian was facing prison, her family's legacy was being dismantled, and Sloane was somewhere toasting her own brilliance. Every time she managed to stand, she was knocked down with even more devastating force. Maybe it was time to give up. Maybe it was time to flee. She picked up a small, brushed steel frame holding the latest ultrasound image, her thumb tracing the delicate curve of her baby's spine. The strong, rhythmic heartbeat she'd heard just that morning in the doctor's office felt like a memory from another life. I couldn't protect you, she whispered, her voice finally cracking. I tried so hard, but I failed. The grief she had suppressed for weeks finally broke through, a silent, suffocating tsunami of despair. She collapsed into the rocking chair, her body racked with deep, silent sobs, finally releasing the months of fear and hopelessness. When the emotional tempest finally passed, a steady hand rested on her shoulder. It was Julian. He looked exhausted, aged a decade, but a new resolve burned in his eyes. He knelt before her. Your father called, he said softly. He's moving his entire offshore portfolio into a new private equity fund. He said to tell you, a Caldwell doesn't fold. We find a new table. And weaker. But as Eleanor walked into the penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, his eyes were as piercing as ever. You look like you tried to out-negotiate a freight train, he said, his voice thinned by illness. Eleanor summoned a weak smile. That's one way to put it. Fair enough, he conceded, motioning with a frail hand toward the armchair opposite him. Sit. Tell me what's been going on while I've been stuck in here arguing with physical therapists. Eleanor sat, and the whole story poured out of her, discovering Julian's affair, his conspiracy with Sloane, her firm's accounts being frozen, the coordinated media attacks, and the unbearable weight of his betrayal. Her father, Richard, listened without a flicker of expression. When she finished, the only sound was the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. So, this is your plan? He asked. To just sit there and let that woman bulldoze our entire legacy? I don't know what else I can do. Yes, you do. Eleanor looked up at him, her vision blurred by a fresh wave of tears. You are a Caldwell, Richard said, his voice regaining some of its old force. You are not a victim. You don't get to be helpless. And you are damn sure not going to let some corporate shark demolish what I spent 50 years building. She's already won, Dad. She has everything. She has taken your opening position, that is all, he countered, adjusting himself on the sofa with a grimace. Back when I was first breaking into the Chicago market, we had a term for this kind of maneuver, a blitzkrieg. Your key partner has been turned, your capital is locked up, and your public image is being systematically shredded. I know it feels like the end. It's not. It's the beginning of the real war. Our first strategy was pure defense, he went on. We were playing damage control with press statements and cease and desist letters. That was a mistake. So now we change the game. What other game is there? Richard's smile was thin and sharp, a ghost of the ruthless negotiator he had been. Sloane has a history, he said. She's run this exact playbook on other tech founders, other family firms. You need to find them. Predators like her leave a trail of wreckage, and the ghosts of those companies have long memories. Find the people she's ruined. Find out what they know. Dig up the evidence she thinks she buried. But how? I don't even know where to begin. You start with the ruins, he said. Go through the archives of tech journals, bankruptcy filings from the last 15 years, and forums for failed startups. Look for her signature. Sloane has been pulling this same stunt for decades. Her fingerprints are all over the world. You just have to know how to look for them. And if I find these people, then what? You do the one thing she would never anticipate, Richard said, his eyes glittering. You unite them. You give them a platform. You offer them a chance at redemption. You don't just fight her. You build an army. Eleanor leaned back, her mind suddenly racing. An army. Sloane's entire methodology was built on isolating her prey, on finding entrepreneurs who were vulnerable and alone, with no one to turn to. She took them down one by one, in the dark, because she's certain they are too broken to ever fight back, Richard finished. But if they stand together, you might just have enough leverage to topple her entire enterprise. Eleanor let the idea settle in her mind. It was an audacious gamble. It was incredibly dangerous. She had no clue if she could find anyone, let alone convince them to join her cause. But it was a plan, a new direction, a reason to get back up. "I'll try," she whispered. "No," Richard corrected her, shaking his head slightly. "You will succeed. Because giving up isn't in our DNA. Not for you, and not for that child." Eleanor nodded slowly, then leaned over and kissed her father's forehead. "You need to rest," she said. "I have some research to do." For the next 72 hours, Eleanor lived on her laptop. She plunged into the digital archives of financial news sites and international business filings. She hunted for common denominators in sudden company collapses, patent infringement lawsuits, and hostile buyouts that ended in financial ruin. She was looking for founders whose stories mirrored what Sloan was doing to her own family. And slowly, meticulously, she began to find them. A clean energy startup in Austin that went under in 2019. The founder was accused of stealing trade secrets based on an anonymous tip to investors. He lost everything. A promising biotech firm in Boston in 2021. The founders were drowned in litigation over falsified data, which allowed Sloan's fund to acquire their patents for pennies on the dollar. A logistics software company in Seattle in 2023. It was the same script, the same devastating outcome. And hidden in the metadata of old archived websites and private equity reports, Eleanor found the digital trail of the same quiet investor, working through a network of shell corporations: Ironclad Capital, Nexus Growth Partners, Meridian Ventures, 4 different corporate entities, 4 destroyed companies, 1 predator. Eleanor compiled all the information into a single, encrypted file: names, dates, cities, and shreds of evidence. Then she started connecting the people. One name appeared in several of the bankruptcy proceedings, not as a victim, but as a financial investigator who had tried to raise the alarm: a man named Daniel Park. Eleanor traced him to a small corporate intelligence agency in a quiet corner of Lincoln Park. She dialed the number listed on his website. It rang 3 times before a man picked up. "Who is this?" Daniel's voice was sharp, wary. "My name is Eleanor Caldwell. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance, a woman who runs Ironclad Capital. I believe you had dealings with her under a different company name." A dense quiet hung on the line. Then a low, resentful voice answered, "The Apex Group. That was the name she used when she helped him demolish my business." "I know," Clara said, her grip on the phone so tight her knuckles turned white. "He's using her to do the very same thing to the preservation district my foundation protects. I was hoping you might consider helping me expose them." There was another heavy pause. "I kept everything," Arthur said finally. "Every forged permit, every offshore account, every fraudulent zoning proposal. I always had a feeling this day would arrive. I knew someone else would eventually start digging for the truth." "I'm leaving now," Clara said. "Just tell me where we can meet." Arthur gave her an address, and for the first time in months, Clara felt a surge of something she thought was long gone. She felt a glimmer of hope. Arthur Chen operated from a cluttered archive in a historic brownstone, a universe away from the gleaming glass towers Marcus Thorne built across Chicago. The varnish was peeling on his door, the windows were grimy, and a single, outdated security camera was pointed at the entrance. Clara knocked. A second later, the door creaked open a few inches. Arthur appeared to be in his late 50s, but the fight had taken its toll, etching deep lines around his eyes and leaving a permanent exhaustion in his gaze. "You're Clara Thorne," he said. It was a declaration, not a query. "I am. Please come in." The inside of the office was a meticulously catalogued disaster. Every bit of wall was covered by filing cabinets, stacks of document boxes, and massive color-coded binders. It felt less like a workspace and more like the private crusade of a man who had been arming himself for a war for more than a decade. "I've been anticipating this for a very long time," Arthur said, guiding Clara down a narrow aisle into a small clearing, waiting for someone else to see him for what he truly is. Someone who could finally use what I've collected. "What is all of this?" Arthur gestured to the boxes consuming the room. "Everything. Every corrupt deal Marcus ever brokered, every city official he bought, every partner he double-crossed. I spent 5 years of my life tracking his every move after he ruined me. I documented it. I organized it. I got it ready. Ready for what?" "For this," Arthur said softly, taking a heavy binder from a shelf and sliding it across a desk toward Clara. "For someone with the influence to make it matter." Clara opened the binder. It was so much more than just financial statements. It was a complete blueprint of Marcus's methods, filled with copies of secret agreements, blackmail notes, and detailed plans for hostile takeovers. "Why didn't you ever bring this to the authorities?" she asked. "I tried." Arthur's voice was brittle with old fury. They were either too compromised by his donations to act, or too inept to follow the money trail. "Marcus has a network of allies, people in positions you couldn't fathom. Every time I got close, my evidence would vanish into a bureaucratic void. He painted me as an unstable, bitter old man with a grudge." "So you gave up?" "I survived," Arthur corrected, his expression hardening. "There's a world of difference. I lost all my savings, and nobody in power would listen to my story. But I kept copies of every single page, waiting for a person with more influence, more resources, and a much bigger reason to tear him down to finally appear." Clara thought of her family's name, her father's legacy, her unborn child. "I have a reason," she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. "Then take it," Arthur insisted, pushing the binder toward her once more. "All of it. Use every last piece, and make that monster pay for what he's done." Clara spent the next 48 hours memorizing every detail of Marcus's treachery. The sheer scope of his deception was breathtaking. She had uncovered a web of corruption and conspiracy that threatened not only their marriage, but the entire city's architectural heritage. He had funneled their personal funds into a series of shell corporations run by a woman Clara now knew the name of. He had used that money to bribe city officials, disguising the payments as consulting fees. He had systematically lied for over a year, risking the future of a historic district and the integrity of his own company. And he had come so close to succeeding, but this was a new situation. This time, Clara possessed an advantage Marcus had never considered. She had a mentor who was the most feared investigative editor in Chicago's history. She had an uncle on the city's Landmarks Commission, and she had a complete, undeniable, digital record of his crimes. Clara made the first phone call. It was to her old editor, Jean. "I know Marcus's legal team threatened your paper with a libel suit to kill the zoning investigation last year," Clara said. "They did." Jean's voice was strained with the memory of defeat. "Their lawyers buried us in motions and threats until the publisher folded. Clara, you don't understand the kind of scorched earth campaign he wages." "I'm starting to," she answered, her voice resolute. "I'm not asking you to publish a story, not right away. I'm asking for your help, completely off the books. No notes, no sources." A moment of silence passed. "What are you about to do?" "I'm going to dismantle Marcus Thorne's empire the same way he tried to demolish our city's history," she declared. "By building a case so airtight." Clara ran a hand over the smooth, rounded edge of the antique crib, a gentle smile on her face. At 8 months pregnant, her universe had shrunk to this nursery, a sanctuary of soft grays and warm creams overlooking Lake Michigan. Her husband, Marcus, was the architect of their immaculate life. As a giant in Chicago's ruthless real estate development scene, he promised a future of bold skylines and soaring profits. "It's a family heirloom," he'd said, gesturing to the ornate wooden music box that had been delivered that morning. "A thorn tradition. Only the most timeless things for you and our daughter." She had smiled, squeezing his hand. "Timeless is what you build." Marcus was a man who lived to erect monuments of steel and glass, and he demanded their home, and thus their family, be the ultimate reflection of his success. Now, surrounded by boxes of baby clothes, Clara decided to sort through an old storage closet. Tucked away in the back, she found a digital photo frame he'd given her on an early anniversary. She decided to load it with ultrasound photos, a modern touch for an old memory. The setup was simple, designed for a past generation of technology. It asked for a 4-digit PIN to access the stored albums. On a whim, she entered the number of their first apartment, a code they hadn't used in years. A soft chime confirmed it was unlocked. She started to browse the old photos, smiling at memories, when the device's background data sync suddenly populated a new, hidden folder on her laptop. The folder was labeled Phoenix. Clara felt a knot of confusion. She opened it, assuming it was an old project file. An interface appeared, showing a timeline of the last 12 months. The first file was a photo album, time-stamped, labeled with only a set of initials. The album was titled SR. A sudden, icy dread washed over her. Who was SR? Her thoughts raced as suspicion hardened into a nauseating certainty. She began clicking through the other freshly synced files. One was a set of detailed travel itineraries. Marcus was supposedly in Toronto for a 3-day urban planning conference, but the records showed his private jet had never flown to Canada. It had made a round trip to Zurich, with a 19-hour layover. The same city mentioned in the expense reports, filed under the SR project name. The pieces connected with cold, perfect logic. The files were a blueprint of a double life. A series of encrypted ledgers detailed something he called Project Phoenix. But the synced folder, now completely accessible, revealed the truth. For Simone, always. The phrase was the title of a private photo album. The dates corresponded perfectly with his investor trip to Singapore. For over a year, he had been living a lie. Every falsehood was a brick in the perfect facade he'd built for her, and now a single forgotten password was bringing the whole structure down. The same ruthless attention to detail she had once admired had just become the architect of his ruin. When Marcus walked into their Gold Coast penthouse that evening, smelling of celebratory scotch instead of the stale air of a boardroom, he found her in the nursery. He was beaming, setting his briefcase by the door. "The city council approved the final demolition permits," he announced, moving to hug her. "We just cleared the way for the most important project this city has seen in a generation." Clara didn't move. She just looked at him, her face a mask of calm. "How was the planning conference?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Productive," he lied, the word coming with practiced ease. "But long. I just kept thinking about the future we're building for our family." "That's odd," Clara said, her voice a near whisper, "because according to this, you weren't at a conference at all." She turned the digital photo frame in her hands to face him. On the screen, a picture of him and a woman embracing in a Zurich hotel suite glowed softly. "This old thing is so useful. It remembers everything." Marcus's triumphant smile dissolved. The color drained from his face as he stared at the damning image on the screen. His carefully constructed alibis failing him for the very first time. That's a doctored invoice," Damien stammered, his hand hovering over the iPad. "A competitor trying to sabotage us, Eleanor. That's all this is." Is this sabotage too? She swiped, revealing a private bank statement. The account was under a shell corporation she had never heard of. The payee was a boutique design firm. The payment dates perfectly matched the delivery dates on the invoices. She locked eyes with him. You told the investors this was for the restaurant's expansion, Damien. So tell me, who is IR? The initials hung in the air of the half-finished nursery, a question he had no answer for. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The celebrity chef, the man who could charm critics and diners alike, was utterly silent. Yes, your new restaurant group is on the verge of collapse. Your partners are getting spooked. What could you possibly possess that would interest us? Thomas reached into his leather satchel and slid a thick manila folder onto the mahogany desk. The season's menu, Thomas said evenly. Your Michelin star concept, 2022. The recipes you lifted from your former sous chef. Damien's lawyer began to fidget. The Vespertine Project, your exclusive supper club, 2023. The health code violations you knowingly covered up to secure the 5-star rating. The lawyer's jaw clenched. And Isabel Rourke, your protege food blogger, 2024. The proprietary supplier, lists you gave her in a hotel suite. Thomas leaned forward, his voice a low growl. We have it all. Every recipe draft, every text message, every lie you told to get to the top. For the first time, Damien's practiced composure fractured. Thomas saw a flash of genuine panic in his eyes. I located your old sous chef, Thomas went on. Remember him? The one you ruined with a slander campaign and a restrictive, non-disclosure agreement. The one you thought you had buried for good. Whatever he might allege, Damien's lawyer cut in, his voice tight, is hearsay. It's an extortion attempt, a bitter, former employee. It will never survive a deposition. That's where you're mistaken, Thomas said, the slightest trace of a smile on his face. He kept his original notebooks, the handwritten ones, with dated and signed entries detailing every single dish you claimed as your own, proof that can't be explained away or erased. Damien stood frozen in the nursery, surrounded by the unassembled pieces of a life he had just destroyed. Soft accent lighting illuminated a top-of-the-line rocking chair. The custom-built wine fridge in the corner, stocked for future celebrations, hummed quietly, a silent testament to the ambition that had cost him everything. He wasn't ruined by a bad review or a rival restaurateur, but by his own hypocrisy, the obsession with perfection and authenticity that he had so successfully sold to the world. The irony was sickening. He'd built an empire on fresh ingredients and honest cooking, promising an authentic experience free from shortcuts. Now, his own disingenuous life had been cataloged with meticulous detail, demolishing the only future that had ever held any real meaning. He looked around the room at the imported Italian crib, the organic cotton mobiles, the silent, waiting space that had witnessed his betrayal. It was a perfect home of his own creation, and now he was a prisoner within it. 2 weeks later, Eleanor met her brother for coffee in the West Village. The city buzzed with a vibrant energy that felt a world away from the oppressive quiet of her high-rise apartment. The first round of legal talks is done, Eleanor said, swirling a spoon in her cappuccino. His attorney had the nerve to call the affair a creative coping mechanism for the stress of the new restaurant launch. Her brother let out a sharp, humorless laugh. He's fortunate you didn't just send that whole folder of invoices straight to the New York Times. I considered it, Eleanor admitted, a tired smile gracing her lips. But it wasn't even needed. The evidence was all there, itemized and irrefutable. My lawyer called it a flawlessly documented trail of financial infidelity and misappropriation of marital assets. She took a long sip of her tea. Damien built the most elaborate culinary empire on a foundation of lies, and in doing so, he created a perfect record of the truth he was trying to conceal. She looked out at the bustling street, one hand resting on her belly, feeling the gentle flutter of new life. The restaurant empire Damien had built was in ashes, but she was still standing. She and her child would write their own recipe now. That evening, in their vast, sterile apartment overlooking Central Park, Eleanor went into Damien's home office. As she stepped inside, the motion-activated lighting he'd custom designed immediately filled the space with a warm, inviting light. A sleek, wall-mounted screen flickered on, displaying glowing press reviews for their flagship restaurant. For a second, her breath caught. The seamless, beautiful design was a constant, aching reminder of the life they had crafted side by side. Then, steeling herself, she walked over to his marble desk and with a few soft taps on her laptop, began the transfer. A new account, a new password, a new future just for her. The collapse of his restaurant group was the headline on every food blog and news site. Former patrons, spurned investors, and fascinated onlookers watched the fallout in real time. Eleanor sat on her sofa, her face impassive, as a reporter read the official press release. The opening of Aperture, Damien's new flagship restaurant, was canceled, citing evidence of investor fraud and severe professional misconduct. News footage showed Damien being hurried out the back entrance of his lawyer's office, a ghost in a designer suit. His famous confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, stunned expression. As his team shoved him into a waiting car, his eyes met the camera lens. Eleanor felt no satisfaction, no thrill of revenge. She just held his gaze through the screen, a quiet witness, until the car sped away. He would have the rest of his days to reflect on the legacy he had burned to the ground. He would forever recall the night he pitched the new restaurant to her as their child's inheritance, all while he was secretly diverting funds to set his mistress up in a design studio. That was Eleanor's victory. That was her justice. Her brother, Thomas, waited until the investor lawsuit became public record before he made his next move. His first stop was the Midtown office of Miles Corrigan, Damien's notoriously aggressive lawyer. The attorney met him in the reception area, looking 10 years older than the last time Thomas had seen him. The professional blowback from the scandal had been swift and brutal. Miles had been suspended by his firm and was now radioactive in the elite legal circles he once commanded. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice strained, "I can't imagine we have anything to talk about." "Oh, I think we do." Thomas strode past him into an empty conference room. "You knew about Damien's fraudulent expense reports. You helped him structure the shell corporation. When your own associates flagged the unusual activity, you had them taken off the account. A lawyer's job is to provide counsel. A partner's obligation is to the firm. You failed at both." Thomas placed a slim hard drive on the polished table. This contains a complete mirror of Damien's personal server. It shows in excruciating detail how the great Miles Corrigan enabled and concealed a multi-million-dollar fraud. You buried his crimes and actively worked to silence anyone who raised questions. "You can't use any of this," Miles hissed, his face draining of all color. "It's already been forwarded to the disciplinary committee. I also took the liberty of endowing a new chair for professional ethics at Columbia Law School. Coincidentally, their first public symposium is a case study on financial fraud within the hospitality industry. Your name features prominently." Miles stared at him, looking as though the world had dropped out from under him. "You taught Damien that rules were for little people," Thomas said. "Now you're going to learn what happens when the truth is the only thing on the menu." He left without looking back. Miles Corrigan put his Upper East Side brownstone on the market before the end of the month. He relocated to a city where no one recognized his name. The second visit was to Damien. Thomas found him in his now shuttered restaurant, supervising the auctioning of the kitchen equipment. He sat in one of the empty dining chairs, watching the broken man who had once been the king of the New York food scene. "If you're here to gloat," Damien said, his voice flat, "I'm here so you understand one thing." Thomas leaned in, his voice quiet and sharp. The very last thing Eleanor felt before her world fell apart was the pure happiness of your son kicking for the first time. She was texting you pictures of the nursery while you were approving fabric swatches for another woman's studio. All while she was on strict bed rest, while her doctors were desperately trying to keep her blood pressure down, warning her to avoid any and all stress. "I didn't know the partnership was built on a lie," Damien muttered, the excuse sounding pathetic even to him. "You didn't care to know. That's 1,000 times worse. You saw Eleanor's frantic string of texts. You saw her dozen missed calls. You knew she was in trouble, and you put your phone on silent so you could have an uninterrupted dinner with your mistress." A film of sweat appeared on Damien's brow, the first sign of genuine emotion Thomas had seen. "Your reputation is destroyed," Thomas said clinically. "Your assets are frozen. Your lawyer is about to be disbarred. You're looking at years of litigation." He rose from the chair and adjusted his coat. "But here is the judgment that will last a lifetime. Every time you close your eyes for the rest of your life, you will see her unanswered messages lighting up your screen. You will hear her voice on the voicemails you deleted. And you will know with perfect clarity that you could have been there, but you chose to be with her instead." Thomas turned and walked to the door. Damien was now sobbing, ugly, gasping sounds that echoed in the cavernous, empty dining room. "Live with that," Thomas said, not turning around. "Forever." The door clicked shut behind him. His final visit was to Isabel. She had posted bail and was under house arrest in her new, lavishly decorated studio. 10 years. Mandatory for investor fraud and illegal demolition permits. The state attorney's office was making an example of him. He would be a cautionary tale by the time he got out, his empire sold for parts. Alara stood across the vast marble island in their penthouse kitchen, watching him try to maintain his composure. He was still in his $1,000 suit, but the power had drained from his posture, leaving him looking like a mannequin. "The performance is over, Julian," she said calmly. He scoffed. "You think you can touch me? I have the best legal team in Chicago. I have connections. You have a stack of forged environmental reports and a junior associate ready to testify against you." Ilara slid a thumb drive across the cold stone. "Every journalist on my press list for the book launch just received a primer on how you built this fortune on lies. Every city council member who took your donations has been given a detailed account of your zoning violations. Every offshore account you used to hide the profits has been meticulously documented and mapped." "This can be handled quietly," Julian said, his voice tight. "It can't." Alara picked up her coat from a chair. "You targeted a historic landmark that my family fought to protect for generations. You saw it as just another property, a problem to be bulldozed in your quest for a skyline-defining tower." She walked toward him, her voice low and steady. "You made a critical error in judgment. I'm the woman who spent 15 years documenting this city's history, and my research is exhaustive." She turned to leave. "I hope you enjoy the view from your cell. And Julian, I will personally fund the restoration of that landmark with the settlement from our divorce, so every day you can be reminded of what you lost." She left him standing there, finally grasping that he had no leverage, no one left to bribe, no way to spin this story. There was only the consequence of his greed. 2 months later, Alara was in a doctor's office, staring at the physician who had just given her the most startling news of her life. Well, the doctor said, smiling warmly, it looks like all that stress was hiding a little secret. You're pregnant. From what I can see, you're about 14 weeks along. Alara's vision swam. A wave of vertigo hit her, followed by a dizzying, impossible clarity that stole her breath. Almost 3 months. The calculation struck her like a lightning bolt. That meant it was from the week before she found the hidden ledgers. The doctor confirmed it during a follow-up call. Yes, Alara. Given the dates, conception happened before you filed for divorce. Alara sank onto her sofa, the world spinning around her. A child, a new life had been taking root inside her, while her old one was being systematically demolished. It felt like a future she had already mourned. Her thoughts raced, connecting the moments. It was undeniable. The last weekend they'd spent at the lake house, before she found Simone's emails, before she uncovered the scope of his corruption. This baby was a living, breathing piece of the life she thought had been a complete lie. Alara, are you there? The doctor's voice asked gently from her phone's speaker, sensing her silence. This is a lot to process. It is, Alara breathed, a shaky laugh escaping her. This was not in the plan. Your body has been through an incredible ordeal, the doctor offered. We can discuss all your options. No, Alara said, her voice finding an unexpected strength. I want this child, more than anything. A kind smile was evident in the doctor's tone. Then let's get you scheduled for your first prenatal visit. We're going to take excellent care of you both. Alara drove to her grandmother's apartment in a daze. Helen, a retired architect in her 80s, was at her drafting table, sketching a garden pavilion. Her world was one of elegant lines and solid structures. She took one look at Alara's face and put her pencil down. What is it, darling? Helen asked, her voice calm and steady. Alara told her everything, the story spilling out in a rush of bewildered emotion. When she finished, her grandmother was quiet, her gaze thoughtful. For a second, Alara saw the fierce woman who had broken barriers in a male-dominated field. Then, her expression softened. A foundation, she said, her voice full of wonder. A new cornerstone. She wrapped Alara in a hug that felt as solid and comforting as the old brownstones she adored. This is your anchor, my love, she whispered into her hair. After all that wreckage, this is your truth. I know. Alara leaned into the embrace. I'm going to name him Orion. Orion, because that's what he was. A constellation to navigate by. A new guide in the darkness. 5 months later, Alara stood before a crowd at the Chicago History Museum for the launch of her book, The City's Bones. The Great Hall was filled with academics, journalists, and preservationists, all there to celebrate the work that had sprung from her personal devastation. Lamplight glowed on the marble floors and ornate ironwork of the historic building. Near the podium, a simple card acknowledged her inspiration. Alara rested a hand on her pregnant belly as she read the dedication silently. To the structures that stand and the foundations that remain. The truest measures of strength I have ever known. Helen stood beside her, radiating a quiet, fierce pride. Her best friend, Maya, was there, finally seeing Alara's triumph after months of quiet support. Her old professor, Dr. Albright, had flown in from New York to witness the brilliant new chapter his former student had written for herself. 4 people, a family rebuilt by integrity and love. You're going to have the best stories to tell, little one. Alara whispered to her belly, I'm naming you Orion because you taught me how to find my way home. She would have been so proud of the woman you are, Helen said. Her voice was rich with emotion. You didn't crumble. I couldn't. I had a new blueprint to follow. Maya gave her arm a gentle squeeze. And now you get to build whatever you want. Alara nodded. a serene look on her face. I am, but with better materials this time. How do you mean? Before, my life was designed to be a showpiece for someone else. For Julian. For the perfect facade of the philanthropic power couple. For the future everyone assumed was mine. She looked around the hall, at her grandmother, her friend, and her mentor. This time, I'm building something that will last. For me. And for the son who showed me what's worth preserving. The life I had to tear down, and the one he is helping me build. The launch party had wound down hours ago, but Alara lingered. She sat on a bench in the empty hall, gazing at the intricate mosaic floor. Her grandmother had gone home, exhausted but happy. Maya had left to post an early, glowing review of the book. Dr. Albright had departed for the airport, promising to make her book required reading for all his graduate students. She was by herself, and for the first time in nearly a year, her world felt solid beneath her feet. She traced the arc of the past 12 months, the sickening discovery, Julian and Simone, on all that was demolished and all that she was now raising in its place. People say you have to tear down to the studs to rebuild, she thought, but that isn't always true. Sometimes you just have to uncover the original structure, the thing that was strong enough to stand for a century, and honor it. Her hand rested on the swell of her belly, the most important restoration project of her life. I lost a marriage, she whispered into the quiet space, to the memory of a past grief. I lost a version of myself I thought was real. I lost a decade, to a man who saw history as something to be erased. But in clearing the rubble, I found her, the woman I was always meant to be. She walked toward the grand staircase, pausing beside a display case holding the original blueprints of the museum. My grandmother, the architect, always said that a building's integrity isn't in its facade. It's in the honesty of its construction. It's making sure the people who build on lies don't get to own the skyline. She touched the cool glass. Julian's name is a synonym for fraud in every developer's office in this city. Simone will spend years trying to rebuild a journalistic reputation that is now worthless. And I get to write the history. She looked up at the vaulted ceiling, at the 100-year-old painted frescoes. This time, I'm not designing my life to fit into someone else's portfolio. I'm building it for me, and for the son who is my legacy. The one I am creating, and the one who created me anew. She turned to go, walking toward the grand doors, toward her future. She paused on the steps, taking one final look at the magnificent building. I'll remember you, she whispered, to the life she thought she had wanted. Always. A lone peregrine falcon, a common sight on the city's high ledges, soared over the park across the street, its form a perfect, resilient shadow against the twilight sky. It circled once before, gliding away between the towers of glass and steel. Ilara watched it go. Then, with a quiet smile, she laid a hand on her belly and walked forward, into the life that was truly hers. 4 months later, on a crisp autumn morning in October, Orion Maxwell Hayes was born. He had his mother's thoughtful, observant eyes and a deep, peaceful soul. He was healthy. He was beautiful. He was a masterpiece of design. Ilara held her son in the sunlit quiet of the hospital room, surrounded by her small, devoted circle. Her grandmother sat by the window, her usual architectural precision having dissolved into soft, happy tears. Maya, her best friend, was already scrolling through artisan websites, looking for the perfect hand-carved wooden mobile for his crib. "Welcome to the world, my brave little historian," Ilara whispered. "We have so many stories to write together." The baby shifted, tucking himself more securely into his mother's arms. And Eleanor Vance, who had witnessed her perfectly architected life get bulldozed, finally grasped the meaning of real wealth. A year later, Eleanor stood overlooking the buzzing collaborative space of her tech incubator, watching founders and investors connect. She had channeled her private devastation into a public mission. The Vanguard Initiative was a nonprofit she established, offering seed funding and mentorship to female tech entrepreneurs, rebuilding after catastrophic professional betrayals. Over 20 women had been given a new blueprint in the last 12 months: funding, legal support, industry connections, a community. Out of a soul-crushing deception, something innovative and powerful had been engineered. Eleanor balanced her son, Leo, on her hip, gesturing toward the San Francisco skyline framed by the incubator's floor-to-ceiling windows. "See that tall glass building?" Eleanor said. "That's where we make sure your older brother's memory builds something amazing. He was the most courageous spirit I have ever known." Leo babbled, pointing a chubby finger at a ferry gliding across the bay. Eleanor laughed, kissing the top of his head. She thought of Marcus, his new venture capital fund, faltering, his genius now relegated to advising obscure startups. She thought of Chloe, who had quietly relocated, her ambitions in Silicon Valley turning to dust. She thought of her father, now retired from engineering, who spent his afternoons playing with his grandson and advising her startup founders. She thought of her first son, of his brief, impactful life, of how his memory had become her quiet resolve. "You made all of us more resilient, my sweet boy," she whispered, "not in the way I had prayed for, but in a way that will echo for generations. You are the cornerstone of this place now, a place that helps other women start again, a legacy of integrity." A young woman approached Eleanor, her expression a mixture of exhausted brilliance and raw hope. It was the same look Eleanor recognized from her own mirror. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice unsteady. "Are you Eleanor Vance? Someone told me you could help. My co-founder, he locked me out of our servers and filed for all our patents. My entire code base. I'm left with nothing." Eleanor gave her a gentle, knowing smile. "Come in," she said. "Let me tell you about anti-fragility. It's the concept that some things actually get stronger from shocks and failures." And as she led the young founder inside, Eleanor finally accepted the truth. Grief doesn't disappear, but you can forge it into purpose. The cracks remain, but you can fill them with resolve. And a mother's love never, ever ends. It just finds a new blueprint to rebuild the world.